Chinese Communist Party is great at spying on people. And not just inside China, but also in America. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The Chinese Communist Party has an extensive network of spies. And over the last 2 decades, the party has rapidly developed its espionage tools. Shelley Zhang sat down with intelligence researcher Matt Brazil, co-author of Chinese Communist Espionage, an intelligence primer, to learn more.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. Brazil.
Happy to.
So, in your book, you say that Chinese espionage has now become like a global superpower. So how scared should we be?
They're world class. And the reason we like to call them world class is that they have recently become equal in ability and reach to any other world class power like the United States, Russia, France, and Britain.
But from looking at the history of Chinese intelligence, it seems like it wasn't really, especially in terms of foreign intelligence, it wasn't really that way until the early 2000s. Is that right?
They began to really get serious in the 1990s. And as we talk about in the book, it was in 1989 that state security decided that they wanted to revamp education, not only for their own officers, but for the general population. And so right after Tiananmen Square, they commissioned a book on Li Kenong, one of their early heroes and who was also the head of their intelligence service in the 50s. So they paid for it, they found the researchers, they wrote the introduction to the book on Li Kenong. And they emphasized that this is for younger generations to learn about the heroes of the past so that they can sharpen their own skills and realize that they too can make a contribution to the revolution.
So why is it important to look back at the history of the Communist Party's espionage activities?
Chiefly because it tells us the facts about how the Chinese communists have run intelligence operations like everybody else. The reality of everybody's spies applies to the Chinese as well as to everybody else. And it also underlines the fact that their operations have always been professional, secret, compartmented, limited to only a few people. And it runs against the old American idea that there is a grains of sand approach by the Chinese, which means basically that China likes to use thousands of ordinary Chinese people overseas to do their spying for them. Nothing could be further from the truth. And that unfortunate characterization leads to the idea that every Chinese person is a potential spy, which is silly, but it's gained a lot of traction in the US and some other countries. And so we were very concerned about that idea because it leads to false assumptions, it leads to bad policy. And so we tried our best to make clear that that's not the case using this book.
What would you say is the biggest misconception about Chinese communist espionage?
One of the biggest misconceptions is that it's mysterious. And indeed, in the modern day, Kang Sheng, the black sheep of the Communist Party who was actually expelled after he died, he's criticized for his mysticism because he used to insist that he could smell a spy, that he could tell a spy by looking at them. And indeed, he persecuted innumerable people with that kind of assumption, and it was accepted. And he was backed up by Mao. He was one of Mao's most loyal adherents, and Mao was loyal to him as well.
It doesn't seem like a great way to run a spy organization, though.
Shoot first and ask questions later, not a good thing. I agree.
So one of the things that you brought up in your book that I thought was particularly interesting was the idea that in the Chinese Communist Party, the intelligence information would kind of get filtered through this Marxist-Leninist lens. Can you give us an example of what that means?
One of the most difficult problems they face internally which they may or may not acknowledge internally, is they use this Marxist-Leninist lens to analyze practically everything. So they have a historical sense. They've got it all figured out as Marxist-Leninists. They have a theory, they have science, they have a way of looking at history that enables them to predict the future. And when things go wrong, then they typically ascribe that to being somebody's mistake or a leftist deviation or something of that sort. And that makes it hard for them to explain things when they can't find that deviation or that villain to blame things on. And so that means that when they try to explain a problem to their higher-ups who also go for this view, that if they can't find somebody to blame it on, then it becomes difficult to make a proper explanation. So this is why they've actually gone after foreigners, like Nate Thayer, for example, the man who reported on the death of Pol Pot. He was approached by the Shanghai State Security Bureau and asked to write some briefs on different problems. And they can take something like that, something written by a foreigner, and show it to somebody who wants to know about a particular problem. And if there's some piece of information in that analysis that's a little bit heretical, they don't get blamed for it.
So it's like, well, that was what this foreigner said, so that's okay. But if it's from an internal source, then it has to kind of be politically correct.
Yes,
Yeah.
you may be familiar with 参考消息, which until the mid-90s was a classified publication. So for the audience, 参考消息 or reference news is a collection of foreign news reports that would not ordinarily make it into the Chinese press. And same thing there. We can put information out about something going on outside of China or maybe even inside of China through a foreign news report and not get blamed for it, not get persecuted.
Interesting. In the book, you talk a little bit about the difference between the Ministry of State Security and the People's Liberation Army, how they're both responsible for intelligence. But in terms of the Western analysis of that, we seem to focus more on the PLA than the MSS. Is it important to have that distinction?
It is, because until the reorganization that happened 3 years ago, the PLA was perhaps the leader in foreign intelligence, or at least they were the more visible part of PRC foreign intelligence because they were getting caught. You may be aware of how a U.S. cybersecurity organization, private company, managed to actually turn the cameras back on the PLA's laptops and view the pictures of the analysts at work, and that's how the FBI got their pictures for those wanted posters.
Oh, right, when the Justice Department indicted some
Yes.
PLA soldiers, right?
Yes, exactly. Now, MSS apparently has been just as successful, maybe even more successful in cyber operations, but the point is they have maintained a much lower profile. And so my co-author, Peter Mattis, likes to call this realization that has occurred in the last 10, 15 years, that there's so much more stuff to be gained through cyber espionage. He likes to call it a dreadnought moment, as in the change in Navy ships at the turn of the last century, where ships suddenly had more armament and bigger guns and longer range. That whole idea of having bigger guns and longer range can be applied here, because now, instead of having to recruit spies, get them in, or run a very expensive and very elaborate signal intelligence operation to get your information that requires satellites and outstations and thousands of analysts and intercept operators, a lot of technology, a lot of money. Now the ability to get these things done can be seen in the software code that's used to infiltrate foreign systems. And of course, once you get into the Office of Personnel Management computers or United Airlines computers, because a lot of U.S. government people fly on United, or Anthem insurance computers, a lot of U.S. government people took insurance through Anthem. There's an unbelievable wealth, treasure trove of information in these places. And so as they've done throughout their history, and as all intelligence agencies do, the Chinese services are going where the secrets are.
You say in the book that they could have been targeting the OPM hack to get the information of government officials. What would they do with that information?
Well, every government official who gets a security clearance has to fill out a form. If it's the case of most of the agencies, it's called the SF50, the Standard Form 50. So you're putting down in that form not only your name, social security number, and date of birth, you're putting down all your friends, all the addresses you've lived in the past X number of years, whether or not you've had exposure to foreign nationals. And so all this information together provides a marvelous profile for someone who is thinking about testing out, possibly recruiting an American.
So they could actually be targeting officials to spy for the MSS or something like that.
Yes, and of course, not only the OPM information, but also the stuff we use every day now because we need to get our names out there to further our careers. LinkedIn has, as you may have read, become a big resource for not only the Chinese services, but also you look at if you look at the open source center that's run by our intelligence community, they have advertisements out there for people to work for them and do precisely the same thing.
So I want to ask about corporate espionage now. Can you name a company that's gone into China that hasn't been spied on?
That would be hard to do in the affirmative or the negative. But there's a baseline of surveillance on all foreigners and all Chinese people in China. And that baseline of surveillance, if you're Chinese, it includes your urban personnel file. It includes all the information that goes into your national ID card, including your race and so on. It includes where you work. If you're a foreigner, when you travel to China, just like this happens in Thailand too, where I recently visited, you check into a hotel, they copy your passport, and they immediately give it to the police. Now, the reason they do this, and if you put yourself in the shoes of the local public security bureau, if something goes wrong with a foreigner, then they're responsible because you're on their turf. They're going to have to answer for whatever it is you did or didn't do, the movements you made or didn't make. So that's why they have a strong incentive to know all about you at that basic level. But they don't really look at you unless they have reason to. They have interest in you if you are working for some sort of sensitive company with high technology, or if you've come to China and you start to do religious proselytizing, or on the Chinese side, if you're a Chinese citizen, they're interested in you if you're a Tibetan, or if you're a Uyghur, or if you're a dissident, or if you're a lawyer for dissidents. Then, of course, they intensify the surveillance. If you're a foreigner who goes to China and you misbehave, even if it looks to you like certain things are legal, if you misbehave, you don't cross all your T's and dot all your I's, then you might be subject to a more intense examination as well.
So does that include people who go to China for business reasons?
Yes.
Like, as a former corporate security advisor, do you think that companies in the U.S. are cognizant of the risks of going into China now? Is that pretty well known?
They are, but whether or not they do proper training is another question, and whether or not their employees accept these realities is another question, because when you go to China, the first thing you notice if you're from a Western country that has a Western level of street crime is there tends to be less street crime. And you also run into people who are very polite to you, who treat you with deference. And it's easy to fall into the impression that everything's a lot better here But the reality is that if there's any interest in you as a foreigner, then you're going to be subject to very intense surveillance. And you won't see it because it's done very well.
So it won't be, kind of like guys in sunglasses following you that you could necessarily spot. A lot of it might be, technology related.
Yes, with all the cameras in China now, it's amazing how many cameras there are and what they can do. Of course, we've read about how artificial intelligence, AI, is being employed to be able to identify people. Police are now experimenting with glasses that they can use to identify people that are linked through Wi-Fi to mainframe servers with all that information. So it's difficult to evade surveillance in China if you're a subject of interest. Of course, if you're not, if you're considered to be an ordinary person going about their business and you're no threat to the state, then you're virtually ignored.
How do you think you and I would do?
I think they'd go after you
That makes me feel better.
because of your exposure in public. And I know that when I used to do my work there, I was watched. And I used to do stuff that was only recently legal. For example, it used to be totally illegal to do TSCM work, which stands for Technical Surveillance Countermeasures. That's finding bugs in tables and walls and stuff like that. That used to be totally illegal. However, the company in the United States, which I won't name, that sells this stuff, that has world-class equipment. I've been trained at their Tennessee facility, and they have lots of customers in China. And why is that? That's because surveillance, electronic surveillance in China has become so ubiquitous. It's not only the government anymore, it's also private individuals. It used to be, for example, up until about 2005, that if you wanted to buy electronic eavesdropping equipment, you had to go to Hong Kong. You'd go to Nathan Road in Kowloon, where all the camera shops are, and you'd be able to find bugs that would work with an FM radio and more sophisticated ones that had their own receivers and so on. But starting about then, this stuff was sold on the mainland by mail. And so now companies are spying on each other. There are plenty of private investigations companies that are using this stuff like mad. And so the Chinese side decided to make legal the acquisition and use of anti-bug detection equipment at that level, at that sort of semi-professional level. But they don't allow you to search for stuff that is at the professional level, that police level listening devices.
So if, it's corporations, like Chinese corporations spying on each other, that's something that you could try to protect against.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's something that is consistent with the Chinese approach using law to rule China. So as you've probably heard many people say, China's not a country that is governed by law. It's a country that they use law to govern. And so what they've wanted to do over the past 10 years is institute laws that are relevant to many areas, but also relevant to espionage, so that they can have codified approaches to catching spies that don't allow for any deviation from party policy. So in other words, they've got it all down on law, what you can do and what you can't do. And that eliminates some measure of corruption, because local officials don't have latitude to do whatever they want. They have to follow the law if they're trying to catch spies.
Obviously, Taiwan is a huge interest to the Chinese Communist Party. Has there been a lot of espionage related to things like the Taiwan elections that are coming up?
Espionage between those two sides, Taiwan and the mainland, indeed is a long-running activity on both sides. There are a lot of cases that we have in the book. We scratch the surface only in the book, of course. And indeed, when we did our research, we had a chance to go through some archives at the Interior Ministry in Taiwan to get some of the historical stuff. And the number of cases there is in the thousands. So there's a long practice of the two sides spying on each other because each considers the other to be its major threat, because each offers a Chinese alternative to the other. And the elections, of course, are of a very strong interest to Beijing, the Taiwan elections, because they are concerned about the incumbent government eventually moving toward advocating independence of Taiwan from the mainland.
Do you have an example of the type of espionage that they would use related to Taiwan?
Yes, there are numerous examples. One of them, for example, involved a colonel in the Taiwan army who went to China after he retired and was recruited there. Probably not intending to be recruited, but he was spotted, assessed, cultivated, and recruited. And then he went back to Taiwan and started to try to recruit others. And he was found out by a junior officer that he had known in service, whom he approached and thought he could recruit to be part of his spy ring, but that junior officer reported him. The Taiwanese military has been a special target of the PRC services for obvious reasons.
In terms of the U.S., what do you think the U.S. government has to watch out for from these Chinese security agencies?
The problem that U.S. officials tend to complain about is that they're overwhelmed and under-resourced. So that's the biggest problem. It's important to remember that the Chinese agencies are using professionals to do their work. And there's another aspect to this too, on the industrial espionage side, of relatively amateurish operations done by state-owned enterprises themselves. They've been given letters of marque from the king, if you will, to go out and get technology secrets by themselves. And this is illustrated quite well in these two FBI videos that you may be aware of. They're kind of cheesy, but they're factual. One is called Game of Pawns.
I did watch that one.
Yes. Game of Pawns about the Glenn Duffy Shriver case, when this young man who was studying in China in a very controlled environment where there's a baseline of surveillance and then you can drill down if you're really interested in somebody. Well, the Shanghai State Security Bureau became very interested in him, and they recruited him to try to pass the Foreign Service exam and then to try to join CIA, and paid him a lot of money to do that. So that's Game of Pawns. The other video is called Company Man, and Company Man is about a state-owned enterprise trying to get secrets, industrial secrets regarding industrial glass from a company in New York. And you can see in this particular video that they went about it in a very slapdash and reckless way, and they got caught because of that.
There seems to be a certain level of entrepreneurial espionage when it comes to the corporate espionage things.
Thanks to Deng Xiaoping.
Was there anything that surprised you as you were researching this book?
I was surprised by the number of cases that we were able to uncover and talk about. And one of the things I was very surprised about was the level of sophistication that has been pursued successfully over the past 20 years. But I think it's important to remember that the whole Marxist-Leninist thing, with them being super committed to Marxism and communism as a vision, the part of the Chinese government where the truest believers reside, there's no moral equivalence in my mind, but you might say the same thing about our own security services, and we like to make fun of it. The television series on Adult Swim called American Dad, for example, features a dad who works for the CIA. He has this misshapen square jaw that's ridiculously huge. He wears an American flag on his lapel. He's totally macho and full of testosterone, and he doesn't tell his family anything about his work. It's because everybody spies. Every society that has a sophisticated and large bureaucratic intelligence service, their citizens are human beings. They react to that stimuli in kind of a human way.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Brazil.
Happy to.